On September 22, 1999, Eleanor Patterson was found dead in her cabin aboard the Paradise Cruise Line's Caribbean Princess. 4 people were connected to Eleanor's story that evening. 4 people had different pieces of information about her final hours, 4 completely different perspectives on what happened in cabin 1247. The ship's doctor declared it a natural death. No investigation was conducted, no questions were asked. But 25 years later, when a deathbed confession emerges from an unexpected source, investigators discover that Eleanor Patterson didn't die from natural causes at all. Before you hear their accounts, subscribe, because you're about to uncover a family secret that was hidden for over 2 decades. 4 people knew different parts of Eleanor's final evening aboard the Caribbean Princess. 4 people carried their own knowledge and assumptions about what had occurred, but only one of them knew the complete truth about how a loving grandmother's life ended in murder. Tonight, you'll hear 4 different connections to September 22, 1999, 4 different pieces of a deadly puzzle, and by the end, you'll understand how greed and desperation can turn family bonds into instruments of betrayal. Because sometimes the person you trust most is the one planning your destruction. My name is Michael Patterson, and I want to be completely honest about what happened to my grandmother, Eleanor, during our cruise in September 1999. For 24 years, I've lived with a secret that has eaten away at my soul, and now, facing my own death, I can no longer carry this burden alone. Eleanor Patterson had been the center of my world since I was 8 years old when my parents were killed in a car accident on Interstate 85 during a winter storm. She didn't hesitate to take me in, changing her entire life to raise a grieving child who had lost everything he knew and loved. She was 61 then, an age when most people are thinking about retirement and grandchildren, not starting over as a parent. Grandmother Eleanor was extraordinary in every way. She had been widowed young when my grandfather died of a heart attack at 55, leaving her to manage his successful construction business and raise my father as a single mother. She proved herself capable of handling any challenge life threw at her, building the business into a regional success and accumulating significant wealth through smart investments and careful planning. When she took me in, Eleanor sold the construction business and focused entirely on giving me the stable, loving home I desperately needed. She helped me through years of therapy to deal with the trauma of losing my parents. She attended every school event, helped with homework every night, and made sure that I understood that I was loved unconditionally, despite the tragedy that had brought us together. Eleanor invested everything in my education, sending me to the best private schools and eventually Duke University, where I studied business and economics. She believed that education was the key to success and happiness, and she spared no expense in ensuring I had every opportunity to build a meaningful career and life. After college, I started a consulting business specializing in helping small companies improve their operations and financial management. Eleanor provided the initial capital and continued to support the business during its early years when cash flow was unpredictable. She believed in my abilities even when I doubted myself, and her confidence gave me the courage to pursue my entrepreneurial dreams. However, by 1999, my business was struggling significantly. The consulting market had become increasingly competitive, with larger firms dominating the industry and technology changing faster than I could adapt. I had made several poor decisions, including expanding too quickly and taking on clients who couldn't pay their bills on time. The financial pressures were overwhelming. I owed over $300,000 to various creditors, including business loans, equipment financing, and credit card debt that I had accumulated trying to keep the company afloat. My monthly expenses far exceeded my income, and I was facing the very real possibility of bankruptcy. I had been hiding the extent of my financial problems from Eleanor because I didn't want to disappoint her or burden her with my failures. She had invested so much in my success, both financially and emotionally, and I couldn't bear the thought of admitting that I was failing despite all her support and sacrifice. Eleanor had always been clear about her financial plans. As her only living relative, I was her sole heir, and she often spoke about how everything she had worked for would eventually be mine. She had approximately $2.5 million in various investments and assets, including her house, her retirement accounts, and a substantial portfolio of stocks and bonds. The cruise had been Eleanor's idea, a celebration of what she called our family bond, and an opportunity to spend quality time together away from the pressures of daily life. She had been excited about the trip for months, researching the ship's amenities, planning shore excursions, and looking forward to formal dinners and entertainment. During the first 6 days of the cruise, Eleanor was in her element. She loved the luxury of the ship, the formal dining experiences, and the opportunity to meet new people. She made friends easily, particularly with a woman named Helen Wright, who shared her interests in bridge and classical music. Watching Eleanor enjoy herself reminded me of why I loved her so much and made my secret financial stress even more painful. Eleanor's health throughout the cruise appeared excellent. She walked miles around the ship's decks every day, participated in activities, maintained her appetite, and showed no signs of the heart disease that would supposedly claim her life. At 72, she was more energetic and vital than many people 20 years younger. On the evening of September 21st, the night before Eleanor died, she mentioned something that changed everything for me. During dinner, she casually mentioned that she had been thinking about updating her will when we returned home. She wanted to establish some charitable bequests to support causes that were important to her, particularly education and healthcare initiatives. "Michael," she said over dessert, "I've been blessed with more money than I could ever spend, and I want to make sure it does some good in the world after I'm gone. I'm thinking about leaving substantial amounts to the University Scholarship Fund and the Children's Hospital. You'll still inherit the house and plenty to live comfortably, but I want my wealth to help other people too." The words hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor was planning to give away large portions of the inheritance I was counting on to save my failing business. In my desperate financial state, I saw this decision as a death sentence for everything I had worked to build. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the ship's decks for hours, my mind racing through increasingly desperate scenarios. If Eleanor reduced my inheritance significantly, I would lose my business, my home, and everything I had worked for. The creditors would force me into bankruptcy, and I'd have to start over at 28, with nothing but debt and failure. I began to think about the timing of Eleanor's decision. She was 72 and in good health, potentially living for many more years. If she changed her will after the cruise, I would have no recourse and no way to prevent my financial ruin. The window of opportunity to preserve my inheritance was closing rapidly. By the early morning hours of September 22, 1999, I had convinced myself that Eleanor's death would solve my problems and that she would want to help me if she truly understood my situation. I rationalized that she had lived a full, happy life and that her death would be a blessing that would save me from destroying everything she had worked to build. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I used the connecting door between our cabins to enter Eleanor's room. She was sleeping peacefully, wearing her favorite silk nightgown and looking serene in the moonlight streaming through porthole. For a moment, I almost lost my resolve, remembering all the love and sacrifice she had shown me throughout my life. But the desperation was stronger than the love. I took one of the pillows from her bed and held it over her face, pressing down firmly while she struggled briefly before losing consciousness. The entire process took less than 5 minutes, and then Eleanor Patterson, the woman who had saved my life and given me everything, was dead by my hand. I sat beside her body for over an hour, making sure she was completely lifeless before I called for help. During that time, I arranged the scene to look like she had died peacefully in her sleep, positioning her body naturally and ensuring that there were no obvious signs of struggle or violence. When I finally called the ship's medical center, I played the role of the devastated grandson who had discovered his beloved grandmother's sudden death. I provided Dr. Collins with information about Eleanor's medical history and medications, emphasizing her age and the stress of travel as potential contributing factors. The ship's medical team and security personnel conducted their investigation professionally, but without suspicion. A 72-year-old woman dying of an apparent heart attack during a cruise was unfortunate but not unusual, and my behavior as a grieving family member seemed entirely appropriate and convincing. Eleanor's death was officially attributed to acute myocardial infarction, and her body was prepared for transport back to North Carolina for burial. The cruise line provided excellent support during this difficult time, helping with paperwork and logistics while expressing their condolences for my sudden loss. The funeral was everything Eleanor would have wanted: dignified, well-attended, and focused on celebrating her life and contributions to the community.
I delivered a eulogy that was entirely truthful about her character, her generosity, and her impact on my life, even though I had been the one to end it. The inheritance process proceeded smoothly, with Eleanor's assets transferring to me as her sole heir according to her existing will. The $2.5 million in various accounts and investments provided me with the resources I needed to pay off my business debts and rebuild my consulting firm on a solid financial foundation. I used Eleanor's money to modernize my business operations, invest in new technology, and position myself to take advantage of the dot-com boom that was transforming the consulting industry. Within 3 years, I had built a successful firm specializing in technology consulting for mid-size companies. In 2003, I married Jennifer Walsh, a teacher I met through mutual friends who knew nothing about my past or the true circumstances of Eleanor's death. We built a loving marriage based on what she believed was my successful business acumen and the inheritance I had received from my beloved grandmother, who had died tragically during our cruise. Jennifer and I had 2 children, James in 2004 and Sarah in 2006. I was determined to be the kind of father that Eleanor had been as a grandmother, loving, supportive, and completely devoted to their welfare and success. I wanted to honor her memory by raising children who would embody the values she had taught me, even though I had betrayed those values in the most fundamental way. As the years passed, the guilt of what I had done to Eleanor never diminished. I threw myself into work and family responsibilities, trying to build a life that would justify the terrible sacrifice I had made. I donated money to charitable causes that Eleanor had cared about, hoping somehow to atone for stealing her opportunity to do good in the world. The success that Eleanor's inheritance had made possible came at a cost that grew heavier each year. Every business achievement, every family milestone, every moment of happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that it had all been purchased with the life of the woman who had loved me most in the world. I often thought about the charitable bequests Eleanor had planned to make, wondering what impact her generosity might have had on education and healthcare if I had allowed her to live and implement her wishes. The money that had saved my business could have saved countless other lives if it had been used according to her intentions. James, our older child, grew up hearing stories about his great-grandmother Eleanor and the sacrifice she had made to raise me after my parents' death. He was fascinated by family history and often asked detailed questions about Eleanor's life, her values, and her relationship with me. These conversations were both precious and torturous, as I tried to honor Eleanor's memory while hiding the truth about how her life had ended. As James matured into adulthood, he developed a strong sense of justice and decided to pursue a career in law. He often spoke about wanting to help people who couldn't protect themselves, and I couldn't help but think about how Eleanor would have been proud of his character and values. In 2023, when I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I began to confront the reality that I would soon face whatever judgment awaited me for the crime I had committed against Eleanor. The cancer was aggressive and inoperable, giving me only months to live and forcing me to consider what legacy I would leave for my children. During my final weeks, the burden of my secret became unbearable. I realized that taking the truth to my grave would mean that Eleanor's murder would never be acknowledged, that she would forever be remembered as having died from natural causes rather than being recognized as the victim of a terrible crime. On December 15, 2023, with only hours left to live, I finally found the courage to confess the truth to James. I told him everything: the financial pressures I had been facing, Eleanor's plans to change her will, and the decision I had made to murder the woman who had given me everything. James was devastated by my confession. struggling to reconcile the loving father he had known with the knowledge that I was capable of such a terrible crime. But I also saw in his reaction the integrity and moral strength that Eleanor had tried to instill in me and that I had betrayed so completely. I died 3 hours after making my confession, finally free from the secret that had poisoned 24 years of my life. My death was peaceful in a way that I didn't deserve, surrounded by family members who loved me despite the terrible truth they had just learned. The confession I made to James was the most important thing I ever did, not because it brought me peace, but because it finally gave Eleanor Patterson the justice she deserved. For 24 years, she had been remembered as a woman who died from natural causes during a pleasant vacation. Now, finally, she could be remembered as she truly was, the victim of a terrible crime committed by someone she had loved and trusted completely. If there is any meaning to be found in this tragic story, it lies in the reminder that financial desperation can drive people to commit acts that destroy not only their victims, but themselves. The money I gained from Eleanor's murder provided temporary solutions to my business problems, but it cost me my soul and poisoned every moment of happiness I experienced afterward. Eleanor Patterson deserved to live many more years, to implement her charitable plans, to see her great-grandchildren grow up, and to continue making the world a better place through her generosity and kindness. Instead, she died at the hands of someone she had raised and loved, betrayed by the very person she had sacrificed so much to help. I pray that Eleanor has found peace, and that somehow, some way, she can forgive me for the unforgivable act that ended her life and shattered the trust she had placed in me. She was the best person I ever knew, and she deserved far better than the grandson who murdered her for money. My name is Dr. Sarah Collins, and I served as the Chief Medical Officer aboard the Caribbean Princess from 1997 to 2003. During my 6 years working in cruise ship medicine, I responded to hundreds of medical emergencies and passenger deaths. But the case of Eleanor Patterson on September 22, 1999, has haunted me for 25 years in ways I never could have anticipated. Cruise ship medicine represents one of the most challenging practice environments in healthcare. You're essentially operating a floating hospital with limited resources, no ability to quickly transfer patients to specialized facilities, and responsibility for the health and safety of up to 3,000 passengers and crew members from around the world. The medical challenges are compounded by the demographics of cruise passengers, who tend to be older adults with complex medical histories, multiple medications, and higher risks for cardiac events, strokes, and other serious conditions. Add to this the stress of travel, changes in diet and routine, and the fact that many passengers view cruises as opportunities to indulge in behaviors they might normally avoid, and you have a recipe for frequent medical emergencies. Eleanor Patterson's case began for me at exactly 2:47 a.m. on September 22, 1999, when I received an emergency call through the ship's medical center. The caller identified himself as Michael Patterson and reported that his grandmother, Eleanor, was unconscious in her cabin and appeared to be having a heart attack. Emergency calls in the middle of the night were unfortunately common on cruises, particularly involving elderly passengers who might experience cardiac events, strokes, or complications from existing medical conditions. I immediately gathered my emergency medical kit and headed to cabin 1247, located on deck 8 in the ship's premium accommodation section. When I arrived at the cabin, I found Michael Patterson, a well-dressed man in his late 20s, standing beside the bed where his grandmother lay unconscious. Eleanor Patterson appeared to be a well-maintained woman in her 70s, wearing a silk nightgown and lying peacefully on her back with her hands folded across her chest. My initial assessment revealed that Eleanor was unresponsive to verbal and physical stimuli. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, her pulse was weak and thready, and her skin was cool and pale. These signs were consistent with a serious cardiac event, though I noted that her positioning seemed unusually neat and composed for someone who had suffered a sudden medical emergency. Michael Patterson appeared genuinely distressed by his grandmother's condition, though I observed that he was remarkably composed for someone who had just discovered a family member in medical crisis. He was able to provide detailed information about Eleanor's medical history, including her current medications and recent activities,
which suggested that he was either very familiar with her health status or had prepared this information in advance. According to Michael, Eleanor had been taking medications for high blood pressure and arthritis, but had no history of serious cardiac problems. She had been in excellent spirits throughout the cruise and had shown no signs of illness or distress during the evening. He reported that he had heard her call his name around 2 a.m., had discovered her unconscious when he checked on her, and had spent several minutes trying to assess her condition before calling for medical assistance. I began my emergency treatment protocol immediately, starting with oxygen administration and establishing IV access to provide medications and fluids. I also connected Eleanor to our portable cardiac monitor to assess her heart rhythm and determine the nature and severity of her cardiac event. The cardiac monitor showed significant abnormalities consistent with a massive myocardial infarction. Eleanor's heart rhythm was irregular and weak, her blood pressure was critically low, and her oxygen saturation levels were dangerously decreased. All of these findings supported the initial assessment of a severe heart attack. I administered medications appropriate for cardiac emergencies, including vasopressors to support her blood pressure, antiarrhythmics to stabilize her heart rhythm, and additional oxygen to improve her breathing. I also prepared advanced life support equipment in case Eleanor's condition deteriorated further and required more aggressive intervention. Throughout my treatment efforts, I continued to assess Eleanor's overall condition and look for any additional signs that might indicate other medical problems or complications. I examined her pupils, checked for signs of trauma or injury, and monitored her neurological responses to determine whether she might have suffered a stroke in addition to the cardiac event. During this time, I also observed Michael Patterson's behavior and reactions to his grandmother's condition. He remained at her bedside, holding her hand and speaking to her softly, even though she was unconscious and unresponsive. His behavior appeared appropriate for a loving grandson facing the potential loss of a beloved family member. Michael continued to provide helpful information about Eleanor's medical history and recent activities. He mentioned that she had been excited about the cruise and had been very active throughout the week, participating in ship activities and making new friends. This information was consistent with what I knew about Eleanor from observing her in the ship's dining rooms and public areas. Despite my efforts, Eleanor's condition continued to deteriorate. Her blood pressure remained critically low despite medication support. Her heart rhythm became increasingly unstable, and her breathing became more labored and ineffective. After approximately 30 minutes of intensive treatment, Eleanor Patterson passed away at 3:15 a.m. The death of any passenger aboard a cruise ship requires specific protocols and extensive documentation. I immediately notified Captain Rodriguez and Security Chief Martinez, both of whom responded to the cabin to conduct their own assessment of the situation. This is standard procedure for any passenger death, regardless of the apparent cause or circumstances. I conducted a thorough examination of Eleanor's body, looking for any signs that might indicate causes of death other than natural cardiac disease. I found no evidence of trauma, injury, or other suspicious circumstances. Her physical condition was entirely consistent with that of a 72-year-old woman who had suffered a massive heart attack. Based on my medical training, clinical observations, and the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's death, I completed her death certificate listing the cause of death as acute myocardial infarction secondary to coronary artery disease. This determination reflected the standard medical assessment for elderly patients who present with sudden cardiac death in the absence of other obvious causes. The ship's captain and security chief reviewed my medical findings and conducted their own investigation of the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's death. They interviewed Michael Patterson about the timeline of events and examined the cabin for any evidence of unusual or suspicious circumstances.
Their investigation found nothing that contradicted my medical assessment or raised concerns about the circumstances of Eleanor's death. Michael's account of discovering his grandmother's medical emergency was consistent and credible, and there were no signs of disturbance or unusual activity in the cabin. One aspect of the case that I noted in my documentation was the delay between when Michael first discovered Eleanor's condition and when he contacted the medical center for assistance. According to his account, he had spent 10 to 15 minutes trying to assess her condition and ensure her comfort before calling for professional help. While this delay was understandable from a layperson's perspective, It was unfortunate from a medical standpoint because earlier intervention might have provided additional treatment options. However, given the massive nature of Eleanor's cardiac event, it was unlikely that even immediate medical attention would have changed the ultimate outcome. I have encountered similar situations throughout my medical career, where family members delay seeking help because they hope the situation will improve on its own, because they want to preserve their loved one's dignity, or because they are uncertain about the severity of the medical emergency they are witnessing. These delays are particularly common when elderly family members are involved, as younger relatives may assume that confusion, weakness, or unresponsiveness are normal age-related changes rather than signs of serious medical emergencies. Educational efforts about recognizing cardiac emergencies have improved over the years, but family member delays remain a significant factor in emergency medical care. Eleanor's case was also notable because of how healthy and vital she had appeared throughout the cruise. Multiple passengers and crew members commented on her energy, her participation in ship activities, and her apparent excellent health during the entire week. She had been walking extensively, eating well, and maintaining her usual social engagement without any signs of cardiac disease. This pattern is not uncommon with sudden cardiac events, particularly in elderly patients who may have significant underlying coronary artery disease without obvious symptoms. Heart attacks can occur without warning, even in people who appear to be in excellent health, and the first symptom of heart disease can unfortunately be sudden death. Eleanor's case served as a reminder that cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of death in elderly adults, and that even people who maintain active lifestyles and appear healthy can be at risk for sudden cardiac events. Her death reinforced the importance of regular medical checkups and cardiac screening for older adults, even those who feel well and have no obvious symptoms. The administrative requirements following Eleanor's death were extensive and required careful attention to detail. I had to complete multiple forms for the ship's medical records, the Cruise Line's corporate offices, and the authorities at our next port of call in Miami. All passenger deaths must be reported to appropriate governmental agencies, and the documentation must be thorough and accurate. I also worked closely with the ship's guest services team to provide support and assistance to Michael Patterson during this difficult time. Losing a family member during what should have been a pleasant vacation is particularly traumatic, and cruise lines have specific protocols for helping grieving families navigate the practical and emotional challenges they face. Michael Patterson's behavior throughout the aftermath of Eleanor's death was entirely appropriate and consistent with that of a devoted grandson coping with sudden loss. He was cooperative with all required procedures, provided accurate information for official documentation, and made appropriate arrangements for transporting Eleanor's body back to North Carolina for burial. In the days following Eleanor's death, I reflected extensively on the case and reviewed my treatment decisions to ensure that I had provided appropriate medical care given the resources and circumstances available on the ship. I consulted with colleagues and reviewed current medical literature about emergency cardiac care in cruise ship environments. My analysis confirmed that Eleanor's death was consistent with a massive myocardial infarction that would have been fatal regardless of the medical intervention available. The severity of her cardiac event, combined with her age and the inherent limitations of shipboard medical care, meant that her prognosis was likely predetermined before medical assistance was even summoned. This case served as a reminder of several important principles of cruise ship medicine. First, the critical importance of having comprehensive emergency medical equipment and medications available for cardiac emergencies. Second, the need for clear protocols to help family members recognize emergencies and respond appropriately. Third, the value of thorough documentation for all passenger deaths to ensure proper investigation and reporting. Eleanor Patterson's death also highlighted the unique emotional challenges of practicing medicine in a cruise ship environment. Unlike hospital-based medicine, where families often have time to prepare for difficult outcomes, cruise ship emergencies occur in settings where people expect only positive experiences and memorable moments. The psychological impact on both medical staff and other passengers can be significant when deaths occur during what are supposed to be carefree vacations. Cruise lines invest heavily in maintaining positive atmospheres and helping passengers focus on enjoyable experiences rather than the medical realities that can affect any population of older adults.
Over the years, I have thought about Eleanor's case whenever I've encountered similar situations involving sudden cardiac death in elderly patients. Her case became a reference point for my understanding of how massive heart attacks can present and progress, and how family members typically respond to sudden medical emergencies involving their loved ones. The medical care I provided to Eleanor represented the standard of practice for cruise ship medicine in 1999. While medical technology and emergency protocols have continued to evolve over the past 25 years, I believe that my assessment and treatment decisions were appropriate and professional, given the knowledge and resources available at that time. When I learned in 2024 that Eleanor Patterson's death had been reclassified as a homicide based on her grandson's death at confession, I was shocked and deeply disturbed. The revelation that Michael Patterson had murdered his grandmother and that I had unknowingly participated in covering up his crime by issuing a death certificate listing natural causes was devastating to my professional conscience. Reviewing the case 25 years later with the knowledge that Eleanor had been suffocated, I can see how the presentation might have been consistent with asphyxiation rather than cardiac disease. The hour-long delay between her death and the medical call would have eliminated most obvious signs of suffocation, and the positioning of her body suggested that someone had arranged the scene carefully. The knowledge that I had been deceived by a murderer and had inadvertently helped him escape justice for over 2 decades has been one of the most difficult professional experiences of my career. It has forced me to reconsider other cases where I may have been too trusting of family members' accounts or too quick to accept natural death explanations for elderly patients. However, I also recognize that the medical evidence available to me in 1999 was genuinely consistent with cardiac death and that Michael Patterson's deception was sophisticated and well-planned. Without obvious signs of trauma or struggle, and given Eleanor's age and the plausible medical history Michael provided, my diagnosis was reasonable based on the information available. The Eleanor Patterson case has become a teaching example in my current work training other physicians about the importance of maintaining appropriate suspicion in cases involving sudden death, particularly when family members might benefit financially from the deceased person's estate. While we cannot become paranoid or distrustful of grieving families, we must remain alert to the possibility that not all deaths are what they initially appear to be. Eleanor Patterson deserved far better than what happened to her aboard the Caribbean Princess in September 1999. She was a vibrant, generous woman who was murdered by someone she loved and trusted completely. While I cannot change my role in the initial misdiagnosis of her death, I am grateful that the truth finally emerged and that she can now be remembered as the victim of a terrible crime rather than simply someone who died of natural causes during a vacation. The medical profession requires us to balance trust in our patients and their families with appropriate skepticism about the information we receive. Eleanor's case will always remind me that even the most plausible explanations can sometimes hide the most terrible truths, and that our responsibility as physicians extends beyond treating illness to recognizing when our patients may have been victims of violence. My name is Maria Santos, and I worked as a cabin steward aboard the Caribbean Princess from 1998 to 24. During my 6 years with Paradise Cruise Lines, I cared for thousands of passengers in their most private moments, but the week I spent observing Eleanor Patterson and her grandson Michael remains one of the most troubling memories of my entire career. Working as a cabin steward on a luxury cruise ship means you become intimately familiar with passengers' daily routines, personal habits, and family dynamics. You see people when they're relaxed and unguarded, when they're stressed or arguing, and when they're dealing with the real challenges that travel can bring to relationships. Most of the time, this access to passengers' private lives is routine and unremarkable, but occasionally you witness things that stay with you long after the cruise ends. Eleanor Patterson was assigned to cabin 1247 on Deck 8, one of the ship's premium staterooms with a private balcony and ocean view. Her grandson Michael occupied the adjoining cabin 1249, connected by an interior door that they kept unlocked throughout the cruise for convenience and security. I was responsible for cleaning and maintaining both cabins daily, which gave me regular opportunities to observe their relationship and individual personalities. From the moment Eleanor boarded the ship, she impressed me as a woman of exceptional grace and kindness. She was always impeccably dressed, beautifully mannered, and genuinely interested in the people around her. When I introduced myself as her cabin steward, she took the time to learn my name, ask about my background, and express genuine appreciation for the work I did to make her cruise comfortable.
Eleanor kept her cabin meticulously organized, which made my daily cleaning duties much easier than they often were with other passengers. Her personal belongings were always carefully arranged, her medications were organized in a weekly pill dispenser on the nightstand, and she treated the cabin furnishings with the respect of someone who understood the value of maintaining beautiful things. What struck me most about Eleanor was her genuine enthusiasm for every aspect of the cruise experience. She loved the formal dining, the evening entertainment, the educational lectures, and the opportunities to meet new people from different backgrounds. She approached each day with the excitement of someone who was determined to extract every possible moment of joy from her vacation. Michael Patterson presented a very different personality from his grandmother. While he was always polite and appropriately dressed, I could sense an underlying tension in him that seemed to increase as the cruise progressed. His cabin was messier than Eleanor's, often scattered with business papers and documents that suggested he was dealing with work-related stress even while on vacation. During my daily cleaning of Michael's cabin, I often found evidence of late-night phone calls and business correspondence. His laptop was frequently open to spreadsheets and financial documents, and I occasionally overheard him making what sounded like tense phone conversations with business associates or creditors, though the poor cellular reception at sea made these calls difficult and frustrating. The relationship between Eleanor and Michael was complex and sometimes strained in ways that became more apparent as the week progressed. Eleanor clearly adored her grandson and was proud of his accomplishments, but I noticed that Michael sometimes seemed impatient with her pace, her social nature, and her enthusiasm for cruise activities that didn't interest him. Eleanor loved to explore every area of the ship, participate in organized activities, and spend time socializing with other passengers. Michael preferred to stay in their cabins or find quiet areas where he could work on his laptop or make phone calls. This difference in vacation styles created subtle but noticeable friction between them. I observed several instances where Eleanor wanted to attend an activity or explore a new area of the ship, while Michael tried to discourage her or suggest alternatives that would keep them closer to their cabins. He was never openly rude or disrespectful, but I could see his frustration when Eleanor's social nature interfered with his preference for privacy and solitude. On the third day of the cruise, I overheard a conversation between Eleanor and Michael that provided insight into some of the tension I had been observing. Eleanor was excitedly telling Michael about her plans to visit various charitable organizations when they returned home, mentioning her interest in supporting educational and healthcare causes with substantial financial contributions. Michael's response to this news was notably unenthusiastic. While he didn't openly object to Eleanor's charitable plans, I could sense his discomfort with the conversation. His body language became tense, and he tried to change the subject to other topics several times during their discussion. This pattern continued throughout the week, with Eleanor frequently mentioning her post-cruise plans for charitable giving and community involvement, while Michael became increasingly withdrawn and seemingly preoccupied with his business problems and financial concerns. On the evening of September 20th, while I was turning down their beds for the night, I overheard a more intense conversation between Eleanor and Michael through the connecting door between their cabins. Eleanor was discussing her intentions to update her will when they returned home, expressing her desire to ensure that her wealth would continue to do good in the world after her death. Michael's response was sharp and argumentative, though I couldn't make out his exact words. The tone of their conversation suggested disagreement about Eleanor's financial plans, and I could hear the frustration in both their voices as they discussed what appeared to be a sensitive family matter. The next morning, September 21st, the tension between Eleanor and Michael was more noticeable than it had been during the previous days. When I cleaned their cabins, Eleanor seemed somewhat subdued, while Michael appeared agitated and distracted. The easy companionship they had shown earlier in the cruise had been replaced by a more formal politeness that suggested unresolved conflict.
During my afternoon cleaning rounds on September 21st, I found Michael in his cabin making what appeared to be increasingly desperate phone calls related to his business. I could hear fragments of conversations about deadlines, payments, and creditors, and it was clear that he was dealing with serious financial pressures that were affecting his ability to enjoy the cruise. Eleanor, meanwhile, had thrown herself even more enthusiastically into the ship's social activities. She spent the afternoon playing bridge with other passengers, attended the cocktail reception, and made plans for the evening's entertainment. Her social calendar was full, and she seemed determined to make the most of their final days aboard the ship. The evening of September 21st was the cruise's formal night, with elegant dining and special entertainment planned throughout the ship. Eleanor was excited about dressing up for the occasion and had spent considerable time preparing her outfit and jewelry. She looked absolutely beautiful and radiant.
Michael, by contrast, seemed reluctant to participate in the formal evening activities. He attended dinner with Eleanor but appeared distracted and uncomfortable throughout the meal. I saw them return to their cabins around 10 o'clock, and I could hear the murmur of conversation through their connecting door, though I couldn't distinguish specific words. The morning of September 22nd began normally for me, with my usual rounds of cabin cleaning and passenger service. When I arrived at Eleanor's cabin around 9 o'clock, she was not there, presumably at breakfast or attending one of the morning activities. Her cabin showed no signs of any problems or unusual circumstances. When I cleaned Michael's cabin about 30 minutes later, he was there, working on his laptop. He seemed more tense and distracted than usual, barely acknowledging my presence, despite normally being polite about greeting me. His bed appeared to have been slept in very little, suggesting that he had spent most of the night awake. Throughout the day on September 22nd, I noticed that Michael seemed increasingly agitated. When I saw him in the ship's corridors or public areas, he appeared preoccupied and anxious, checking his watch frequently and seeming unable to focus on conversations or activities. This behavior was markedly different from his usual reserved but composed demeanor. Eleanor, by contrast, seemed to be having one of her best days of the cruise. I saw her at lunch with her new friend Helen Wright, laughing and animated as they discussed their bridge tournament victories and plans for staying in touch after the cruise ended. She appeared healthy, energetic, and genuinely happy about the friendships she had made during the week. That afternoon, Eleanor returned to her cabin briefly to rest before the evening's farewell activities. When I encountered her in the hallway, she was excited about the final night's entertainment and mentioned how much she had enjoyed meeting so many wonderful people during the cruise. She seemed to be glowing with satisfaction about the week's experiences. Michael, meanwhile, continued to appear stressed and distracted. I saw him on his cabin balcony several times throughout the afternoon, either talking on his phone or simply staring out at the ocean with what appeared to be deep concern or worry. His behavior suggested that he was grappling with serious problems that were weighing heavily on his mind. The evening of September 22nd was the cruise's farewell celebration, with special dining events and entertainment planned throughout the ship. Eleanor attended these activities enthusiastically, while Michael seemed to participate reluctantly and without his usual courtesy toward other passengers. I completed my evening duties around 11 o'clock that night, finishing the turn-down service for all cabins in my section and preparing for what would be the final night of the cruise. The ship would dock in Miami early the next morning, and passengers would begin disembarking by 8 o'clock. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by unusual activity in the corridor outside my crew quarters. I could hear people talking in urgent, hushed voices, and the sound of equipment being moved quickly through the hallways. This type of late-night activity usually indicated a medical emergency, which unfortunately occurred with some regularity on cruises with many elderly passengers. I learned from other crew members that the medical team had been called to cabin 1247, Eleanor Patterson's room, and that there appeared to be a serious emergency situation. The medical staff was in the cabin for an extended period, which suggested that they were dealing with a significant health crisis. By morning, word had spread among the crew that Eleanor Patterson had died during the night from what appeared to be a heart attack. Michael Patterson was understandably devastated by the sudden loss of his grandmother, and the ship's guest services team was providing him with support and assistance for the necessary arrangements. When I cleaned Eleanor's cabin on the morning of September 23rd, it was clear that it had been the scene of a medical emergency. The bed linens were disturbed, medical equipment had been used, and personal items had been moved around during the emergency response efforts. The sight was sobering and sad. Knowing that such a vibrant, kind woman had suffered her final moments in what should have been a place of comfort and relaxation. Michael's cabin that morning showed signs that he had been awake for most of the night. The bed was barely disturbed, tissues were scattered around the room, and he had clearly begun packing his belongings in preparation for leaving the ship. He was not in the cabin when I cleaned it, presumably dealing with the extensive paperwork and arrangements required following a passenger death. What struck me most about the entire situation was how sudden and unexpected Eleanor's death had seemed. Throughout the week, she had appeared to be in excellent health, maintaining an active schedule and showing no signs of the cardiac problems that apparently claimed her life. The contrast between her vitality during the day and her death that night was shocking and difficult to comprehend. I also reflected on the tension I had observed between Eleanor and Michael regarding her charitable plans and will changes. It seemed tragically ironic that Eleanor was planning to make generous bequests to help others, only to die before she could implement these wishes. The timing of her death, just as she was preparing to redirect her wealth toward charitable causes, struck me as particularly unfortunate. Over the years, I continued to think about Eleanor Patterson and the week I had spent observing her daily life and interactions with her grandson. Her death had been one of the most affecting passenger losses I had experienced during my cruise ship career, partly because I had gotten to know her personality and character through our daily interactions. I also thought about Michael Patterson and how he had coped with the sudden loss of his grandmother. While his grief had appeared genuine and appropriate,
I sometimes wondered about the stress and tension I had observed in him throughout the cruise and whether these pressures had somehow contributed to the tragic outcome. The experience taught me important lessons about the fragility of life and the unpredictability of medical emergencies, particularly among elderly passengers who might appear healthy but have underlying conditions that could prove fatal without warning. It also reinforced my appreciation for the passengers who treated crew members with kindness and respect, as Eleanor had done throughout her final week. When I learned in 2024 that Eleanor Patterson's death had been reclassified as a homicide based on Michael's deathbed confession, I was horrified but not entirely surprised. The revelation explained some of the tensions and behaviors I had observed during that final week, particularly Michael's increasing agitation and his apparent discomfort with Eleanor's charitable plans. Looking back on the cruise with the knowledge that Michael had been planning his grandmother's murder, I could see signs that I had missed or misinterpreted at the time. His stress and anxiety, which I had attributed to business problems, may have been related to his planning of the crime. His resistance to Eleanor's social activities may have been motivated by his desire to control her movements and ensure privacy for his planned attack. The conversation I had overheard about Eleanor's will changes took on a much more sinister significance when I understood that Michael was facing financial ruin and viewed Eleanor's charitable plans as a threat to his inheritance. What I had interpreted as a simple family disagreement about money was actually a dispute that would lead to murder. The timing of Eleanor's death, coming just hours after her conversation about changing her will, was not the tragic coincidence I had originally believed. Instead, it was the result of Michael's calculated decision to kill his grandmother before she could implement the charitable bequests that would have reduced his inheritance. The hour-long delay between Eleanor's death and Michael's call for medical assistance, which had seemed like the natural confusion of a family member discovering a medical emergency, was actually the time Michael needed to ensure that Eleanor was dead and to arrange the scene to look like natural death. Most disturbing was the realization that I'd been an unwitting witness to the planning and aftermath of a carefully orchestrated murder. The stress and tension I had observed in Michael was not just business pressure, but the psychological burden of planning to kill the woman who had raised and loved him. Eleanor Patterson had been one of the kindest, most generous passengers I had ever served during my years in cruise ship hospitality. She had treated me and other crew members with genuine respect and appreciation, and she had approached every day of the cruise with enthusiasm and joy. She deserved to live many more years and to implement the charitable plans that would have helped countless people. Instead, she was murdered by the person she trusted most in the world, someone she had sacrificed her own plans and comfort to raise after his parents' death. The betrayal was complete and devastating, made worse by the fact that Michael had been able to hide his crime for over 20 years while benefiting from the inheritance he had stolen through murder. The Eleanor Patterson case changed how I think about family dynamics and the potential for violence within relationships that appear loving and supportive from the outside. It reminded me that Financial desperation can drive people to commit acts that seem unthinkable, and that even the closest family bonds can be corrupted by greed and selfishness. Working in cruise ship hospitality means witnessing many different types of family relationships and dynamics. Most are positive and loving, but Eleanor's case taught me to be more observant of signs of tension or conflict that might indicate more serious problems beneath the surface. I am grateful that the truth about Eleanor's death finally emerged, even though it took 24 years. She deserves to be remembered not as someone who died of natural causes during a pleasant vacation, but as the victim of a terrible crime committed by someone who should have protected and cherished her. The confession that brought justice for Eleanor also serves as a reminder that secrets of this magnitude cannot remain hidden forever. Michael Patterson carried the burden of his crime for over 20 years, and ultimately the guilt became too heavy to bear. His deathbed confession provided the closure that Eleanor's case had always needed. Maria Santos left cruise ship work in 2004 to focus on raising my own family, but the memory of Eleanor Patterson and the week leading up to her murder remains one of the most significant experiences of my career. It taught me about the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect, because we never know what challenges or tragedies they may be facing in their personal lives. Eleanor Patterson was a remarkable woman whose life was cut short by greed and betrayal. While nothing can undo the terrible crime that ended her life, I hope that the truth about her murder will help ensure that she is remembered for the generous, loving person she was, rather than simply as someone who died unexpectedly during a cruise vacation. My name is Helen Wright, and I had the extraordinary privilege of becoming friends with Eleanor Patterson during what turned out to be the final week of her life aboard the Caribbean Princess in September 1999. At 70 years old, I was an experienced cruise traveler who had taken dozens of voyages around the world, but my friendship with Eleanor during that tragic week remains one of the most meaningful and ultimately heartbreaking relationships of my entire life. I encountered Eleanor on the second day of the cruise in the ship's elegant card room, where a bridge tournament was being organized for passengers who enjoyed competitive card games. We were randomly paired as partners for the afternoon session, and I was immediately impressed by Eleanor's skill at the game, her gracious sportsmanship, and her delightful sense of humor about both our victories and our occasional mistakes. Eleanor played bridge with the same enthusiasm and intelligence that she brought to every other aspect of her life. She was strategic without being ruthless, competitive without being unkind, and always focused on ensuring that everyone at the table enjoyed the experience regardless of their skill level. Her approach to the game reflected her character perfectly. She wanted to win, but not at the expense of other people's enjoyment or dignity. After our bridge session, Eleanor and I discovered that we had much more in common than our love of card games. We were both widows who lost our husbands within the past few years. We shared interests in classical music and theater, and we both believed that travel was one of life's greatest pleasures and most important educational experiences.
Eleanor was traveling with her grandson Michael, whom she clearly adored and worried about in equal measure. She spoke about him with obvious love and pride, describing how she had raised him after his parents' tragic death in a car accident, and how she had tried to provide him with every opportunity for success and happiness. I was traveling alone on this particular cruise, having decided after my husband's death that I would not let solitude prevent me from continuing to explore the world. Eleanor and I naturally began spending time together during meals, activities, and shore excursions, forming the kind of instant friendship that sometimes develops between compatible people in the unique environment of a cruise ship. What impressed me most about Eleanor was her remarkable vitality and her concrete plans for the future. Despite being 72 years old, she was actively making detailed plans for travel, charitable giving, and new experiences. She spoke enthusiastically about wanting to take a Mediterranean cruise the following year, with specific itineraries in mind for visiting the Greek islands and the Italian coast. Eleanor also talked frequently and passionately about her desire to make a meaningful impact with the financial resources she'd been blessed to inherit from her late husband. She had been widowed young, but had worked hard to build and maintain her wealth through careful investments and conservative financial management. Now she was excited about the opportunity to use that money to help others and make a positive difference in the world. During our daily conversations over meals and during quiet moments on deck, Eleanor mentioned repeatedly that she was planning to substantially update her will when she returned home from the cruise. She felt that her current estate planning was outdated and no longer reflected her values, priorities, and understanding of where her money could do the most good.
Eleanor was particularly interested in supporting educational causes and healthcare initiatives, having seen firsthand how these areas could transform lives in communities. She spoke about establishing scholarship funds, supporting research programs, and creating endowments that would continue to help people long after she was gone. Her planned charitable giving was not just theoretical. Eleanor had done extensive research into specific organizations and programs that aligned with her values. She carried a notebook filled with information about various charities, their effectiveness ratings, and their financial transparency. She approached philanthropy with the same thoughtfulness and attention to detail that she brought to every other aspect of her life. Eleanor's relationship with her grandson Michael was complex and sometimes puzzling to observe. She obviously loved him deeply and was tremendously proud of his accomplishments, but I sensed underlying tensions that she didn't fully understand or acknowledge. Eleanor tended to see the best in people, sometimes to the point of overlooking warning signs that might concern others. Michael seemed devoted to his grandmother, but I noticed that he could be impatient with her social nature and her enthusiasm for cruise activities that didn't interest him. Eleanor loved meeting new people, participating in organized events, and exploring every area of the ship, while Michael preferred solitude and seemed preoccupied with business matters that he conducted through frequent phone calls and laptop work. I observed several instances where Eleanor wanted to attend an activity or explore a new part of the ship, while Michael tried to discourage her or suggest alternatives that would keep them in their cabins or other private areas. His behavior wasn't openly disrespectful, but I could sense his frustration with Eleanor's active social schedule and her desire to make the most of every moment of the cruise experience. During our bridge games and meal conversations, Eleanor occasionally shared concerns about Michael's personal and professional life. She worried that he was working too hard and not taking enough time for relationships, relaxation, and the simple pleasures that make life worth living. She hoped that the cruise would help him understand the importance of balancing work demands with family time and personal fulfillment. Eleanor also mentioned that she had been encouraging Michael to consider marriage and starting a family of his own. She looked forward to the possibility of great-grandchildren and wanted to see Michael settled and happy in his personal life. She often said that professional success meant nothing without people to share it with, and she worried that Michael was becoming too focused on his business at the expense of everything else.
On the third day of the cruise, Eleanor confided in me about some specific concerns regarding Michael's financial situation. She mentioned that his consulting business was struggling and that she had been providing him with financial support to help him through difficult periods. While she was happy to help him, she also worried that her assistance might be enabling him to avoid making necessary changes to his business model or career direction. Eleanor's generosity toward Michael was clearly motivated by love, but I could sense that she was beginning to question whether continuing to provide financial support was truly helping him or simply postponing difficult decisions that he needed to make independently. She wanted to support him without creating dependency or preventing him from developing his own problem-solving skills. As the cruise progressed, Eleanor became increasingly excited about implementing her charitable plans when she returned home. She had used the peaceful, reflective environment of the ship to clarify her priorities and make specific decisions about how she wanted to distribute her wealth. The cruise had given her the time and mental space to think deeply about her legacy and the impact she wanted her money to have on the world. Eleanor spoke about her post-cruise plans with the enthusiasm of someone who had found her true purpose in life. She was excited about meeting with lawyers and financial advisors to restructure her estate planning, establishing charitable foundations, and beginning the process of making substantial gifts to causes she cared about. She also mentioned that these changes would require some difficult conversations with Michael about family finances and future plans.
Eleanor wanted to ensure that Michael would be financially secure, but she also wanted him to understand that the majority of her wealth would be directed toward charitable purposes rather than simply being passed down within the family. On the evening of September 20th, Eleanor seemed particularly thoughtful and reflective during our dinner conversation. She talked about how the cruise had helped her gain clarity about her values and priorities, and how she felt more confident than ever about the direction she wanted to take with her charitable giving. Eleanor also expressed some concern about Michael's mood and behavior during the cruise. She had noticed that he seemed increasingly stressed and distracted, and she wondered whether she should be doing more to help him with whatever problems he was facing. She was considering offering him additional financial support, though she was uncertain whether that would be helpful or would create additional pressure. The next day, September 21st, Eleanor seemed somewhat subdued during our morning bridge game. She mentioned that she and Michael had had a difficult conversation the previous evening about family finances and future plans. While she didn't provide specific details, I could sense that there had been disagreement about her intentions regarding her estate and charitable giving. Despite this family tension, Eleanor threw herself enthusiastically into the day's activities. We attended a lecture about Caribbean history, participated in a wine tasting, and spent the afternoon playing bridge with other passengers. Eleanor seemed determined to enjoy every moment of the cruise, despite whatever personal concerns she was dealing with. That evening was the cruise's formal night, and Eleanor was excited about dressing elegantly for the special dinner and entertainment. She had brought beautiful jewelry and a stunning evening gown, and she looked absolutely radiant when we met for cocktails before dinner. Her appearance and demeanor gave no indication of the family tensions she had mentioned or any concerns about her health. During formal dinner on September 21st, Eleanor was animated and engaging, discussing the week's highlights and making plans for staying in touch with the friends she had made during the cruise. She exchanged contact information with several passengers and made tentative plans for future travel together. Her energy and enthusiasm were infectious, and everyone at our table commented on how much they had enjoyed getting to know her. The final full day of the cruise, September 22nd, began with Eleanor and me attending the morning bridge tournament together. She played exceptionally well that day, making several brilliant strategic moves that helped us win the competition. Eleanor was delighted with our victory and insisted on treating me to champagne to celebrate our partnership and friendship. During lunch that day, Eleanor seemed particularly reflective about the cruise experience and what it had meant to her personally. She talked about how much she had learned about herself during the week, how the peaceful environment had helped her clarify her priorities, and how excited she was to return home and begin implementing her plans for charitable giving. Eleanor also mentioned that she felt the cruise had been exactly what she needed to prepare for the next phase of her life. She spoke about feeling energized and purposeful, ready to tackle the legal and financial work required to establish her charitable foundations and begin making the kind of impact she had always dreamed about. That afternoon, Eleanor and I attended the traditional afternoon tea service together, where she was particularly social and engaging. She chatted with other passengers about their cruise experiences, shared contact information with people she wanted to stay in touch with, and made everyone feel included in the conversation. Her ability to connect with people and make them feel valued was remarkable. Eleanor's final evening aboard the Caribbean Princess was spent attending the farewell show and participating in the ship's closing night celebrations. She was thoroughly enjoying the entertainment and seemed to be savoring every moment of the cruise experience. Her energy and enthusiasm were evident to everyone around her, and several passengers commented on how much her positive energy had enhanced their own cruise experience. After the evening's entertainment concluded around 10 o'clock, Eleanor and I exchanged contact information and made specific plans to stay in touch after returning home. She invited me to visit her in North Carolina, and we discussed the possibility of taking another cruise together the following year. Eleanor hugged me warmly and thanked me for making the cruise so special and meaningful for her. That was the last time I saw Eleanor Patterson alive, and the memory of her warmth, enthusiasm, and genuine friendship during that final evening has stayed with me for 25 years. The next morning, I was awakened early by unusual activity in the ship's corridors and the sound of medical equipment being moved through the hallways. When I inquired with the cabin steward about the commotion, I learned that there had been a medical emergency during the night and that one of the passengers had passed away. When I discovered that the passenger who had died was Eleanor, I was absolutely devastated. The woman I had spent the entire week with, who had been so vibrant and full of life just hours earlier, was gone. It seemed impossible to believe that someone so healthy and energetic could have died so suddenly and without warning.
I immediately sought out Michael to offer my condolences and to share my memories of Eleanor's final week. He was understandably grief-stricken and struggling to cope with the sudden loss. He thanked me for the friendship I had shown his grandmother and said that knowing Eleanor had enjoyed our time together provided him with some comfort during this difficult period. Michael explained that Eleanor had died peacefully in her sleep from a massive heart attack, and that the ship's doctor had assured him that she had not suffered during her final moments. While this information was somewhat comforting, it did nothing to ease the shock of losing someone who had seemed so healthy and alive such a short time before. What troubled me most deeply about Eleanor's death was how completely unexpected it had been. During our many conversations throughout the week, she had never mentioned any heart problems, chest pain, or other symptoms that might have indicated cardiac disease. She had been taking medications for blood pressure and arthritis, but these seemed like routine health maintenance for someone her age. Eleanor had also been remarkably active throughout the cruise, walking extensively around the ship's decks, climbing stairs without difficulty, and participating in all activities without showing any signs of fatigue, shortness of breath, or other symptoms that might have suggested heart problems. Her physical condition had seemed excellent for a 72-year-old woman. The timing of Eleanor's death, coming just as she was preparing to implement major changes to her estate planning and charitable giving, seemed particularly tragic and ironic. She had spent the cruise clarifying her priorities and making specific plans for using her wealth to help others, only to die before she could put those plans into action. I found myself thinking about all the good that Eleanor's charitable foundations might have accomplished if she had lived to establish them. She had been passionate about education and healthcare causes, and her financial resources could have made a meaningful difference in these areas for years to come. The financial implications of Eleanor's death for Michael were significant, though I tried not to dwell on these considerations out of respect for his grief. Eleanor had mentioned throughout the cruise that Michael was her only heir, and that she wanted to ensure his financial security while also supporting charitable causes that were important to her. Over the months following the cruise, I maintained contact with Michael through occasional letters and cards. He seemed to be coping reasonably well with his loss, and was apparently using Eleanor's inheritance to stabilize and expand his consulting business. I was glad to know that Eleanor's financial support was helping him achieve the professional success she had always wanted for him. I never took another cruise after September 1999, partly because the memories of Eleanor were too strong, and partly because the experience had reminded me of how quickly life can change and how precious our relationships truly are. Instead, I focused on my own charitable activities and tried to honor Eleanor's memory by supporting some of the same causes she had cared about. When I learned in 2024 that Eleanor Patterson's death had been reclassified as a homicide based on Michael's deathbed confession, I was horrified beyond words. The revelation that Michael had murdered his own grandmother, the woman who had raised him and loved him unconditionally, was almost impossible to comprehend. Understanding that Eleanor had not died peacefully of natural causes, but had been suffocated by someone she trusted completely, was devastating.
The knowledge that I had unknowingly spent Eleanor's final week watching her interact with her future murderer made every memory of the cruise painful and disturbing. Looking back on that week with the knowledge of what Michael had been planning, I could see signs that I had missed or misinterpreted at the time. His increasing tension and anxiety, which I had attributed to business stress, may have been related to his planning of Eleanor's murder. His discomfort with Eleanor's charitable plans, which I had seen as simple disagreement about money, was actually his reaction to learning that his inheritance would be reduced. The conversation Eleanor had mentioned having with Michael about her estate planning on September 20th was not just a family discussion about finances, it was the trigger that led to her murder less than 48 hours later. Michael's knowledge that Eleanor was planning to redirect substantial portions of her wealth toward charitable causes had motivated him to kill her before she could implement these changes. Most heartbreaking was the realization that Eleanor died just as she was preparing to do the greatest good of her entire life. Her charitable plans would have helped countless people through education and healthcare initiatives, but those opportunities were stolen along with her life by someone who cared only about personal financial gain. Eleanor Patterson was one of the most remarkable people I ever had the privilege to know. Her intelligence, generosity, and genuine care for others made the week we spent together on the Caribbean Princess one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. She deserved to live many more years and to see her charitable dreams become reality. The fact that she was murdered by her own grandson, someone she had loved and supported throughout his entire life, represents a betrayal so complete and devastating that it challenges everything I thought I understood about family bonds and human nature. Eleanor had given Michael everything: her love, her guidance, her financial support, and ultimately her life, and he had repaid her with the ultimate act of selfishness and greed. I am grateful that the truth about Eleanor's death finally emerged, even though it took 24 years. She deserves to be remembered not as someone who died of natural causes during a pleasant vacation, but as the victim of a terrible crime committed by someone who should have protected and cherished her above all others. The Eleanor Patterson case serves as a reminder that even the closest family relationships can hide the most dangerous secrets, and that financial desperation can drive people to commit acts that seem unthinkable. It also demonstrates the importance of protecting elderly family members from those who might exploit their trust and vulnerability for personal gain. Helen Wright continues to honor Eleanor's memory through charitable giving and volunteer work with organizations that support elderly abuse prevention and family violence awareness. While nothing can undo the terrible crime that ended Eleanor's life, I hope that her story will help prevent similar tragedies and ensure that other families recognize and address warning signs before it's too late. Eleanor Patterson's legacy should not be the manner of her death, but the example she set for how to live with generosity, purpose, and love for others. Her friendship during that final week of her life was a gift that I will treasure forever, and her memory continues to inspire me to approach each day with the same enthusiasm and kindness that she brought to everything she did. 24 years later, in December 2023, Michael Patterson lay dying in a hospital bed in Charlotte, North Carolina, his body ravaged by pancreatic cancer.
At 52 years old, he had built a successful consulting business, married and raised 2 children who were now adults. But as his final days approached, the weight of a secret he had carried for over 2 decades became unbearable. His son James, now 35 and a respected attorney, had been keeping vigil at his father's bedside. Michael had always been a devoted father, but James noticed that something beyond his terminal diagnosis had been troubling him during his final weeks, a deep sadness and anxiety that seemed unrelated to his medical condition. On December 15, 2023, with only hours left to live, Michael finally found the courage to unburden himself of the truth that had haunted him for 24 years. "James," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I need to tell you something about your great-grandmother Eleanor, something I've never told anyone." The confession that followed shattered everything James thought he knew about his father and his family's history. Michael revealed that Eleanor had not died from a natural heart attack as everyone believed. Instead, desperate about his failing business and mounting debts, Michael had suffocated his grandmother with a pillow as she slept, then waited over an hour before calling for medical help to ensure she was dead. Michael explained that Eleanor had planned to change her will after the cruise, intending to leave substantial portions of her estate to charitable causes. Learning this information during their final evening together had triggered a panic that led to the most terrible decision of his life. Michael died 3 hours after making his confession, leaving James with the devastating knowledge of his father's crime and the difficult decision of what to do with this information. For 6 months, James struggled with the knowledge of his father's murder of Eleanor. He consulted with legal colleagues and researched the implications of reporting a crime committed by someone who is now deceased. In June 2024, James finally contacted the Charlotte Police Department and provided a detailed statement about his father's deathbed confession. Detective Maria Rodriguez was assigned to review all available evidence from Eleanor Patterson's 1999 death. Working with federal authorities who had jurisdiction over crimes committed in international waters, she began the process of officially reclassifying Eleanor's death from natural causes to homicide. The investigation revealed that Michael's business records from 1999 showed he was facing bankruptcy with over $300,000 in debt. Insurance and inheritance documents confirmed that Eleanor's death had provided Michael with approximately $2.1 million, which he had used to pay off his debts and rebuild his consulting firm. Paradise Cruise Lines provided copies of all records from Eleanor's death, including Dr. Sarah Collins' medical reports and the ship's security investigation. Dr. Collins, now retired, reviewed her findings and confirmed that suffocation could have presented symptoms similar to those she had observed in 1999. The case attracted significant media attention when details of the investigation became public. Helen Wright, now 95 years old, was interviewed by investigators about her memories of Eleanor and Michael during the cruise. Her recollections of Eleanor's vitality and charitable plans provided important context for understanding Michael's motive. Maria Santos, the former cabin steward, was also located and interviewed about her observations during the cruise. Her memories of the tension between Eleanor and Michael, particularly regarding Eleanor's will changes, provided additional support for the investigation.
While Michael Patterson could not be posthumously prosecuted, the case was officially closed, with Eleanor's death reclassified as a homicide. Eleanor Patterson's death certificate was amended to reflect the true cause of her death, providing some measure of justice after 24 years. James Patterson struggled with the aftermath of his father's confession and the media attention surrounding the case. He ultimately decided to honor his great-grandmother's memory by establishing a charitable foundation using some of the inheritance money that had been obtained through her murder. The Eleanor Patterson Foundation focuses on supporting elderly abuse prevention programs and provides resources for families dealing with financial elder abuse. James has spoken publicly about the importance of protecting vulnerable elderly family members from those who might exploit their trust. The case serves as a reminder that financial desperation can drive people to commit unthinkable acts against those who love them most, and that even the most seemingly loving family relationships can hide deadly secrets. Eleanor Patterson's murder remained hidden for 24 years because it was committed by someone she trusted completely, using a method that mimicked natural death in an environment where thorough investigation was not standard procedure. Only Michael Patterson's deathbed confession finally brought the truth to light. 25 years after her death, Eleanor Patterson finally received the justice she deserved. While her killer escaped earthly punishment, the truth about her murder ensures that her memory will be preserved, not just as a victim, but as a reminder of the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves.